Here we go.
Hello and welcome to Heywood Hill's first ever Zoom experience. I hope it won't be our last, but let's see how it goes, shall we? Wherever you're tuning into us from tonight, you're incredibly welcome. Whether you're in California or Cairo, Riyadh or Rochdale, as I happen to know somebody is, you are deeply welcome, and it means that I know you are a fellow collaborator in civilization. We like to think that Heywood Hill is a little oasis of civilization here in Mayfair. Mayfair that's been rather quiet this year for some inexplicable reason. But we're not being downhearted, we're getting on, carrying on, because we know there are lots of people who will come and see us again when they can. Now, I'm standing outside the shop because I thought those of you who love the place might like to see it. So, here goes. Hello and welcome. Here I am on Curzon Street, rather busier this evening than it has been earlier this week. And there she is, Heywood Hill. We've got our Christmas decorations up through the black door. And there is Andrew Turton, our bookshop manager. Hello, Andrew.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. And here you can see that the shop is absolutely groaning, packed full of all the latest publications, not just from this autumn, but of course all of the books that should have been published earlier in the year. And there's a very nice selection indeed here in the shop. There are three very exciting things happening in London on the literary front tonight. The first is the Booker Prize, which is going to be announced shortly. And here are the 6 shortlisted books. A bit of a mixed bag. Who's going to win? We'll find out soon enough. Secondly, and more importantly for Heywood Hill, we're going to change somebody's life tonight. Here is an example, illustration of what you receive if you're a subscriber to our personalised monthly book subscription, A Year in Books. Tonight we're giving away a lifetime subscription to one lucky person. We ran a competition recently where we asked people to nominate somebody who deserves a life-changing literary treat. We've had thousands of entries, and I'm going to ask our panelists to help me pick the winner. But that's not what we're here to discuss, and we're not here to discuss the Booker either. We're here to talk about this book, this charming facsimile edition, an enhanced facsimile edition of the 6th Duke of Devonshire's Handbook. And that's what we're going to be talking about from here in the Rare Books room at Heywood Hill.
Hello, everybody, and that's where I am now. Again, you're incredibly welcome this evening, as are the 2 very distinguished panelists who we have joining us tonight. First, John Martin Robinson, who's an architectural historian and a man of many parts. At Heywood Hill, blessed are the writers, and John is a renowned writer with something like 30 books to his name, and he's contributed some astonishing number of articles, around 400 to Country Life over the decades on architectural matters. And during all of that time, he's also been an independent advisor to owners of country houses across the country and perhaps beyond. In fact, he's a trustee. So trusted is he that he has become a trustee of, I'm not sure if he still is, but he has been, of 3 of the finest stately homes in the country, Wilton, Burley and Arundel. You still a trustee of those 3, John, at the moment?
Yeah, Burley a few years ago. I was a trustee there for 5 years, but I'm still a trustee at Arundel and Wilton.
Very good. Well, sticking with Arundel, you are also the librarian there, to the Duke of Norfolk, which makes me think of Casanova, who, of course, was also a librarian to a nobleman. Marvellously, John is also an officer of arms, currently Maltravers Herald Extraordinary. Unfortunately, we couldn't persuade him to don his regalia this evening, but there is nothing ordinary about John Martin Robinson, and we're extremely lucky and privileged to have him with us today. John, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you.
And secondly, we have Stoker Devonshire. Stoker is an English peer, having inherited the Dukedom of Devonshire in 2004, and with it responsibility for the stewardship of Chatsworth, the breathtaking palace of the Peak that many of us will know. Not only is he one of the most interesting men I've ever met, he's also an extraordinary force for good in numerous galvanizing ways, large and small. Stoker has been responsible in significant part for the renovation and renewal of a whole variety of British institutions, from the horse racing industry as a whole to the rebuilding of Ascot Racecourse, where he served as Her Majesty's representative for many years, to Sotheby's, where he provided a steady hand during some tumultuous decades as the auction house's deputy chairman. He's been a trustee or patron of numerous arts organisations, from the Wallace Collection here in London to Storm King in America. And along with Amanda, his wonderful partner and collaborator, he has bought art from a young age and has supported in different ways numerous painters, sculptors, potters, furniture makers, and silversmiths. His energy and positivity is magnetic and is part of the reason why hundreds of thousands of people visit Chatsworth every year. And it is there, Stoker and Amanda have spent more than a decade renewing this old house with an energy and determination that has been a wonder to behold. Everyone who has anything to do with it speaks to that and their incredible energy. And that has been very much in the tradition of sheer enthusiasm that the sixth Duke also brought to his endeavours. So we're very lucky to have them. Hello, Stoker. Good evening. Can you hear me?
You've unfrozen. I don't know whether during that intermission when I couldn't hear you declared an interest, but you certainly should have done. It was very kind what you said, but I think it is worth everybody being aware that you are our son-in-law and married to our daughter, and therefore what you said about me was naturally tinged with perhaps rather optimistic glasses. Anyway, very nice to be here.
Well, it's very nice to have you here. But we're not talking about either of our panelists in any more detail, particularly tonight. We're talking about this wonderful publication, and the reason we've got it, though, is because it has been produced at Stoker's instigation as part of a sort of product from his membership of a distinguished club of bibliophiles known as the Roxburgh Club. And of course, John is also a member of this club. And John, perhaps you can explain to those of us who don't know what the Roxburgh Club is.
The Roxburgh Club is the oldest society of bibliophiles in the world. It was founded in 1812, and it's called after the third Duke of Roxburgh, John, Duke of Roxburgh, who died in 1804. And his collection of books was sold in 1812, and it was a great event. Here is a portrait of the Duke of Roxburgh. It's by Bertone. It was painted on his grand tour in Italy in 1761, and he's wearing his coronation robes for the coronation of George III. I mean, he was a courtier. He lived in London. He was many positions in the royal household, and he was both a Knight of the Thistle and a Knight of the Garter. But he had 3 houses in St. James's Square, and they were piled to the roof with books. He started buying books as a boy and carried on all through his life, buying particularly Shakespeare and also Incarnate books published before 1500. And his house was full of those. Well, after his death, the title was inherited by a cousin who wasn't interested in the books, and they were all sold in a great sale in June 1812. And the key point was the sale of a first edition of Boccaccio's Decameron, and this fetched over £2,000, which was then the world record price for a book. And all the people who'd been at the sale and had bid it up to that extraordinary price decided to have dinner that evening in London. It was organised by the Reverend William Dibdin, who was the librarian to Lord Spencer, the second Earl Spencer, who was the sixth Duke of Devonshire's uncle, interestingly, and some of the interesting books which the Duke had came from Lord Spencer, I think. Anyway, they had dinner that evening, and then they had dinner again the next year in 1813, and that was the beginning of the society, which has 40 members, and we still meet every year. We have the anniversary meeting in June, where we have a good time. We have dinner, look at books, and we drink a toast to John, Duke of the immortal memory to John, Duke of Roxburgh, and to bibliomania throughout the world. So that's sort of annual. So the club's gone on very strongly ever since. Now, its point, apart from conviviality and love of books, is to publish, and the club itself, from the beginning, has published rare editions, little reprints of books that are so rare they're either manuscript or they're not more than 3 printed copies. Also, the members individually are expected to publish a book in their membership lifetime and to give it to the president and the members of the club.
Brilliant. That's really, really helpful context. And so, Stoker, you've been a member of the club for a while. Why have you decided to publish this book this year?
Well, as you say, I've been a member for quite some time. In fact, the sixth Duke who wrote the Handbook, which is what we're talking about, was a founder member. He bought at the sale, and all his successors to the dukedom, including I'm lucky enough to be, have been members. And as John has pointed out, it's one of the sort of obligations of the members to produce a book to give to the other members. And that was beginning to weigh rather heavily on me. Here are, in the library where I'm sitting at the moment in Chatsworth, lots of previous Roxburgh Club editions. Originally, they were all bound the same, but then individuality rather took over. And so I knew that I had to produce a book, and for years I couldn't really think what to produce. But as I will explain perhaps later as well, the Sixth Duke's Handbook was an incredibly useful reference book for us when we were refurbishing the house after we moved in 2006. And I got very fond of it, very, very enthusiastic about it. And we used it a lot. There's several different editions. The one at the bottom is one of 6 volumes, the big edition, which is illustrated. Then there's the copy that you have, the edition you have in your hand. The next one up is the Roxburgh Club edition in its own special binding. And then 2 of, I think, only 12 copies, which were published by the Sixth Duke. They weren't for general consumption. They were for friends and relations, great friends and close relations only. And so it just seemed to be a really good idea to share the book and let more people see how interesting and how amusing it is.
Indeed. And John, turning to the Sixth Duke and his world, what can you tell us about him and what sort of man he was and the circle that he moved in?
I mean, the Sixth Duke of Devonshire is a very sympathetic character, I think. I mean, he was the epicenter of grand Whiggery. You know, the Cavendishes were always been one of the leading Whig families, and he himself did play a public role. He was Lord Chamberlain under the end of George IV's reign and also under William IV. He was a special ambassador to Russia for the coronation of Tsar Nicholas I. He was a member of the Privy Council. He took his public duties very seriously. And, you know, for instance, he voted against the slave trade. He voted to abolish the slave trade. He voted in favour of Catholic emancipation to allow Catholics equal rights in England. He voted to cut down the working hours of children in factories and so on. So he was a very public-spirited man. But as he got older, he became slightly deaf. And this is a portrait of him as a teenager by Archer Shee, painted as a young man. He inherited the dukedom when he was only 20. His father died young. Both his parents died quite young, and he inherited, so when he was in 1811. But as he got older, he became slightly deaf, and this made him less sort of active, perhaps, in public life. I mean, he did his duty, but he threw himself into his own great interests, collecting, gardening, books, sculpture, and his vast achievement at Chatsworth, where he more than doubled the size of the house and really created Chatsworth as it is today. I mean, it was a great 17th century house, but he added on a huge neoclassical wing. He inherited many of his good qualities. His mother, the beautiful Georgiana, this is a famous portrait by Gainsborough of Georgiana, who was beloved by everybody and a great Whig hostess, a great friend of Charles James Fox, and she helped to get him elected for Covent Garden in the Westminster election, where she went in her open carriage through the market crowd, sort of blowing kisses and waving at everybody, and supporting the Fox's election. Fox was elected. Anyway, so she was very interested in books. She was the sister of Lord Spencer, the first president of the Roxburgh Club, and it was her library really that the sixth Duke inherited and was the basis of the library at Chatsworth. But he added to it enormously. This is a portrait of him by Sir Thomas Lawrence, the leading portrait painter of the day, and you can just see a little glimpse of Chatsworth in the background. Chatsworth was his absolute pride and joy. He was devoted to Chatsworth. It was the centre point in his life, really. But he built up the library enormously. He bought whole libraries, other people, John Kemble's plays, Bishop Dampier of Ely, he bought at the Roxburgh sale, as we've just heard. This lithograph is in some way, he thought this was the best portrait of himself. It was printed later, drawn and printed later on in about 1852. And it shows him with his family. He himself was a bachelor, never married, but he was very fond of all his nephews and nieces. And he's sitting here, and in the background you can see a big urn, and that's inscribed Blanche. And Blanche was his beloved niece, the daughter of his sister Georgiana Carlyle, to whom this edition of the Handbook that we've reprinted was dedicated. But Blanche married his heir, who you see sitting there as well, William Lord Burlington, who succeeded as Duke of Devonshire. And the sixth Duke adored these two, and Blanche, and lots that he did at Chatsworth, he did in the knowledge that they would inherit and it would be their house. But then there was a terrible tragedy, and Blanche died very young in 1840. And he erected this vase in the garden at Chatsworth in memory of her. And there's also a Latin inscription in the hall, very poignant, saying that he completed it in his year of sorrow, which is the year that she died. You can just see here as well some of his horticultural interests. On the left, you can see the banana plant, the banana, which was called after him. So Musa Cavendishi. And he gave plants from his hothouses, and they were sent all over the Pacific and all the commercial. But when you buy bananas in shops today, they're all descendants of this banana tree. So it's the commercial banana tree throughout the world. But his great thing, as I said, was the extension of Chatsworth and the adding on of this vast north wing. This is a drawing by his architect Wyatville, Sir Geoffrey Wyatville, who did Windsor Castle for George IV. That's his most famous work. But really, Wyatville's work at Chatsworth is Wyatville's best work, and he worked very closely with the Duke, and it incorporated lots of the Duke's ideas, like the tower on the left with the belvedere to admire the views. That was a sort of one of many ideas that were the Duke's own. And you can see the 17th century house, the great palace that was built by the first Duke after the Glorious Revolution, and then the long north wing, with a great sequence of entertaining rooms, the dining room, the sculpture gallery, the orangery, the banqueting room and belvedere. And this continues an enfilade that goes through the old house in the form of the library, which had been the 17th century long gallery.
Perfect, thank you, John. Stoker, so coming to how do you think about the Sixth Duke? What do you think of him as a man, and how does your family view him as such?
Well, I think that we were brought up, and rightly so, to think of him as a really thoroughly good egg. My great-grandmother, Evie Duchess, who was the person after the Bachelor Duke to take a particular interest in Chatsworth, naturally, as so often happens, rather rejected the previous generation's taste. And so she spread it about the place, and she pushed his work to the side as much as she could. But by the time it came to my parents moving back here after the war in 1958, I think my mother particularly had taken up the cause of the Sixth Duke and admired him and cherished him. And in the book she wrote about the house, she used a lot of excerpts from this handbook to introduce different rooms in the house, and that was an extremely good idea because it gives it good historical perspective. I'm sitting, as I said earlier, here in the library at Chatsworth, and this is a watercolor which is included in the reprint, the facsimile of the handbook. This is the first stage of the Sixth Duke's change of what had been the first Duke's picture gallery. He'd by this time, the Sixth Duke had taken all the paintings off the walls, and actually the only space he could find for them was the ceiling of the ballroom at the far end of the house. And the next illustration, the next image, is of the library as it is now, with the added balcony, because, as John just said, he was a very enthusiastic buyer of books. He was a very enthusiastic shopper, sort of full stop, but books was one of his main interests and main acquisitions. And so he needed to make a balcony to put all the books. I believe there are about 17,000 volumes here, and it does make, it is a wonderful sort of credit to his taste and to his acquisitions. And it's a lovely thing, a lovely room to sit in.
I'm very glad that John has reappeared. I think it disappeared for a moment.
Just for a glass of water.
A very good idea. We should have all had some of that. John, just turning then from the library to the handbook itself, not the facsimile, but the original. What are its special characteristics?
The handbook, I mean, is quite simply the most interesting guidebook to an English country house. And certainly, by far the most interesting one written by an owner of an English country house. And it represents, it's partly autobiographical. The Duke wrote it as a long letter. It's a combination of a guided tour of the house and in the form of a letter to his younger sister, Harriet, who was Harriet Granville. She was married to Lord Granville, who was the British ambassador in Paris. And as the Duke says, writing it to her in this form made the job ennui-less for him. He found it much more easy and friendly to write it in that form. And it begins at the front door, and he takes her right round the house, not just the public house, but things like the kitchens and the cellars, everything, the bedrooms. And it's written in an extraordinary, charming, immediate, friendly style. It's almost like conversation. Now, the book, as was said earlier, there only seem to have been 12 copies printed, and they were all given to his immediate relations and very, very close friends. And they all have this similar inscription in them. This is the one to Georgiana, another of his sisters who was married to George Lord Carlisle. And the inscription reads, "This book is presented to Georgiana, Countess of Carlisle, with the request that it may be considered as private as a letter from her affectionate Devonshire." And all the known surviving copies have the same inscription in his own hand. Now, the actual form of the book it's got precedence in, the guidebooks that were written to English country houses for tourists in the 18th century. The earliest is a book by an Italian, Gambarini, to Wilton in the 1730s. And then there's a whole industry. There are hundreds of 18th century guidebooks to English country houses, many of them written by the owners. The guidebook to Kettleston, for instance, in the 1760s, was written by Lord Scarsdale, a neighbour of the Sixth Duke. So he'd have been aware of these. And of course, the key example is Horace Walpole's Guide to Strawberry Hill, which the Duke knew about. And obviously that was one of his sources of inspiration in doing this. But the handbook is much more than just a guidebook. As I said, it's autobiographical, and it tells very personal and moving stories about his childhood, of him sitting on the roof reading a book when he was a boy. And he describes, I find, a rather amusing event, slightly painful for him. When they had Christmas parties for the school children and things in the entrance hall, and people came there, and a poor man brought a tame hare to show to the Marquisino, as he put it, i.e. the Marquis of Hartington, as he then was. And he has so tame that it nearly bit my finger off. I've still got the scar today. And it's that sort of personal story that really brings it to life.
I like the one where he's in the kitchen and he says that he remembers that he had, when he was in Paris as a young man, had sent his chef to the French court to learn how to cook, and that the French king had very kindly taken him on, even though he was being worried about being poisoned by everybody in France. So it's that sort of thing.
Exactly, it's a good tale, that, and and it's full of jokes. I mean, he's very humorous and personal. I think the Sixth Duke's a charming person. One would have liked to, sat at dinner listening to him. Not all historical figures fall into that category. Anyway, so that's the sort of handbook, and I mean, it's in a special form, because a handbook, as opposed to a guidebook, a handbook's personal. And it wasn't for visitors, it was for personal. But it tells you all that he did at Chatsworth. And it's incredibly modest, really, considering the scale of his project. I mean, it was by far the most expensive private building project in England at the time, together with Paxton's work in the garden. The total bill came to £300,000. Which was enormous. An average big country house would cost about 10,000.
Well,
So it gives you an idea.
Well, that's extremely interesting. Stoker, turning to you, what did you learn from the handbook about Chatsworth and indeed about the Sixth Duke?
Well, I think there's two different aspects to this. The first is, which is the most important, is his absolute love of Chatsworth and Derbyshire, emotions, of course, which I share very much indeed. He loved this place, and he loved the surrounding countryside. He loved the people who lived up here. He was deeply interested and had great reverence for his parents, quite rightly, and for his ancestors. He had great respect for proper research. He did a lot of the research for this book himself. He looked into the old account books and made a lot of references to that research, so that he wasn't he was a myth buster, not a myth creator. And in historic houses, there tends to be an awful lot of myths, stories that have been handed down from one person to the next and believed because an older person told a younger person. But he wasn't for that. He was for finding out what had actually happened and who had done what and said what. And the other part of what I love about this book, and what I think other people would love about this book, is the really detailed, fascinating interest that he had in every aspect of the collection, both his own and the one that he had inherited. A tremendous respect for the past and a great enthusiasm for the present and the future. And one of the things that we did, partly really because of this picture, this drawing in the handbook. This is of the sculpture gallery, which was built by Wyatville for the sixth Duke. In fact, it's almost identical to the kitchen at Windsor Castle by the same architect. If you're in one, you could easily be in the other, except for the decoration below. And this drawing inspired us to return the sculpture gallery to what it was in this picture, which was in about 1858, just before the Duke died. And so if you show us the next image, Nicky, we will see it as it is now, and it is virtually identical. Every piece, I'm glad to say, is still here. We had to return some pieces from the garden. That big tassa in the middle was out in the garden. My parents had brought the lions at the far end in, and on the right foreground is Canova's Sleeping Endymion, which was commissioned by the sixth Duke when he went to see Canova in Rome in, I think, about 1820, 1821. So the book has inspired us, and not only inside, but also outside, because, of course, that Duke had met and then hired Joseph Paxton, and I think you might have a picture of Paxton handy, who became head gardener aged just 23 and came to Chatsworth from the RHS where he'd been working. And Paxton and the Duke, between them, created an extraordinary, really a landscape rather than a garden. And one of the main features was the rockery, which Paxton built. This is a photograph of it now, looking downhill, obviously. My parents did some restoration here, but there's no plan, so it's a little bit difficult to know whether what looked like a fallen column was meant to be a column which hadn't fallen, or was meant to be a fallen column. We just have to decide what we think looks best now. Tom Stuart Smith has been doing a lot of wonderful work here, extending and enlarging this rock garden. But in the 19th century, it was really just a precursor to what, if you went left-handed along this path in front of you, what you found at the end of the path, which was this extraordinary glass house. The Great Stove, they called it, and it was built in about 1843 to the design of Paxton, completely unqualified engineer, but he made it up as he went along with great effect. And this was a very good sort of precursor for the Crystal Palace, which he designed and built in just 11 months in 1850, for the Great Exhibition of 1851. This huge greenhouse was built to house the extraordinary collection of exotic plants which the Duke was collecting from all over the world. He had people looking for him in South America and in the Far East, and they brought these things back, and they were grown by Paxton with great success in this enormous building. Sadly, it survived until after the First World War, but by then it was a bit broken and all the plants had died, and so it was destroyed by my great-grandfather, I think probably with hindsight quite rightly. And this is what remains. You can see the outside wall, which was the basis of it. My parents put a maze in the middle, which is still there and very popular, and there's gardens at each end. So that is a sort of memorial skeleton of Paxton and the sixth Duke and what they did at Chatsworth.
Moving on to the new publication, which, as I described it, is a enhanced facsimile. It's not just a straight facsimile of the original. John, what do you think about this new publication? And I mean, I have a strong vested interest. We are Heywood Hill is the exclusive bookseller of this book, so you can only get it here. But John, forgive me for that. What do you think makes it special?
Well, I think it's a wonderful book. I've always thought it was marvellous, because I first discovered it years ago when I was doing my research on the Wyatt family, including Geoffrey Wyatville. And when I came to the archives at Chatsworth, I first saw it then and thought it was absolutely delightful. So when the Duke asked me whether I'd edit it, I, couldn't have been more delighted. It was the sort of job that I jumped at. In some ways, it's a joint effort because it owes a great deal to the design by Rob Dalrymple in Scotland. And it's based on 3 of the copies in the library at Chatsworth. The copy of which we saw the inscription, which was given to Georgiana Carlyle, is the printed facsimile. But the Duke himself also had his own working in which he kept little notes of things he'd acquired after 1845 when it was published, or things that he bought and things that people had given him, or just things that had been moved around. And so they were all in his own writing in the margins. And so with Rob Dalrymple's design, you can see here the facsimile is full size, but the book was produced by Rob as a large paper copy with these wide margins. And in the margins, the writing in blue are the the 6 Duke's later editions, telling us of things that have been done since it was printed in 45. And then the little notes in black are my editor's notes explaining who some of the artists, some more obscure artists and sculptors were, and Derbyshire neighbours at the time, and other historical figures who aren't as well known now perhaps as they were in the Duke's lifetime. Then also we've included illustrations in this copy. The Duke always intended to have an extra illustrated version of the handbook, and he had 2 large paper copies printed for himself, but he never got round to doing it. But he had really, I think he first had the idea of doing this quite early on when he was doing all the building work at Chatsworth in the 1820s and 30s, although it wasn't written until 1844-45. But he commissioned watercolours from various artists, William Cohen, for instance, and Hunt, which are all still at Chatsworth. Now, what happened in the end was it was his great niece, Lady Louisa Egerton, who was the daughter of the 7th Duke, sister of the 8th Duke. She broke up one of the big paper copies into 6 volumes and inserted the watercolors and prints and extra illustrative material into it. So we use some of that in this book, and I think it's a really handsome, interesting book.
It's really beautiful. Particularly charming end papers. What are they?
Oh, well, they're very interesting. Obviously, they're sort of pink roses on a white ground. They're actually the library curtains at Chatsworth.
You can see them behind me.
Oh, yes.
They're immediately behind me.
Yes. So we thought that was a good joke, really, to have the end papers based on the library curtains.
And how long does a project like this take to go from start to finish?
Well, we worked on it quite quickly, really. I can't remember now. I think we started about 2 years ago. The Duke would remember.
Yeah,
when,
I think. Yeah, I mean, it was an idea that I'd had, as I said, but thanks to John and his brilliant editing, it's really brought it to life. It's made a whole difference, and I think that the Bachelor Duke would be incredibly pleased with what he's produced. In many ways, it's the best. In every way, really, it's the best of all the editions. And what is so thrilling is that we can now share it with lots of people, and I think it'll give a huge amount of pleasure to people who are fans of Chatsworth like I am. I hope so, anyway.
Well, it's absolutely gorgeous. I have another question for you, John, quickly, which is on the printing of the original. I noticed this. The new facsimile is printed in Belgium, which I probably shouldn't emphasise. But where was the original printed? Do you think? Do we know?
Yes, it was printed by a printer called Schoberl, Schoberl in London, who I think possibly was. I don't know much about him. He could be a German printer, but it was printed in London.
Right.
The original edition.
And Stokely. So just finally, the process has been enjoyable from your point of view?
Well, it's been educational, which as I get older, I find more and more enjoyable. But I think what would be equally educational would to hear, I think there are one or two people who kindly asked some questions. Do you think, Nicky, we might move on to that?
There are. We've got a couple of questions. Let me move on to those. And I've got a couple here. One for John, actually, which is, from James Miller, did the sixth Duke, do we think he consciously omitted anything when he was publishing the book?
I don't think I don't think consciously. It is very, very full, and of course the great interest of it for us, is the Duke describing what he himself was doing at Chatsworth and the reasons why he did things. He explains why, he demolished certain things or added on certain things or enlarged certain rooms or used particular types of marble or stone and so on. So it's a very personal description and a record, of great value to historians of what he did at the house. But he was very comprehensive, as the Duke has just said. I mean, he did do research. I mean, he quotes sort of some of the original building accounts from the late 17th century, for instance, the carvers' bills for the beautiful wood carvings in the chapel, which were always attributed historically to Gwyn and Gibbons. And the Duke says the bills are signed by other people, by other London carvers, called Lobb, and a Derbyshire carver called Watson, and so on. And he quotes the original bills, sort of based on that research. And also because there's some rooms at Chatsworth, which were said to be, the rooms where Mary Queen of Scots stayed. She did stay at Chatsworth, but in fact the house was rebuilt 100 years later, so they're not the exact rooms. But the Duke again goes into all that and quotes from Mary Queen of Scots correspondence, so he knew all those original papers. So I don't think he excluded anything deliberately. It's very, very comprehensive. And there are obviously things that he didn't write about. He doesn't say that much about his parents, for instance, work at Chatsworth. Georgiana and the fifth Duke did redecorate the family rooms on the first floor of the south front, and he doesn't really describe that very much or who worked on it. But I think to him it was just modern, like all of us think of our parents. Work in a house as well. Everybody knows what it is. We don't need to describe it.
Thanks, John. Stoker, Diane Jeffrey is wondering whether there's time for. Well, you mentioned that your mother used extracts from the handbook in her book of the house. Is it time for an update? Show the developments at each location since that book was published 40 years ago.
Well, yes. I think it probably is, but I think that I would, if it happened, I think that Amanda and I will follow the Bachelor Duke's example and keep it extremely private. Then maybe in 150 years or whatever, somebody can share it out. But I certainly wouldn't want to write anything for publication about what we've done. That would be, I think, entirely inappropriate.
Now we've got a few more questions that popped up, which is marvellous. One asking if we're open after the 2nd of December. Well, we don't know that. We're still trading, and
we very much owe you or us or both.
No, this is. Oh, I see. I just with Heywood Hill. I can't really think about Chatsworth, I'm afraid. But Heywood Hill is defiantly operational at all times, regardless of the pandemic. What about Chatsworth? What's
the garden's open and it's wonderful, and you have to book, but only on the day if you want to. We hope to be open on the 3rd of December. We confidently expect we will be. The farm shop's open, it never closed. It's been a great success. And I've been buying books from Heywood Hill throughout the pandemic, and it's given me a great deal of pleasure.
Thanks for the plug. Thank you very much. Now, John, the great Edward Bulmer is wondering if how Hardwick is described, if it is in the handbook.
Yes. Now, the Duke, I mean, he intended, he tells one of his sisters that he intended to do a series of handbooks on all his houses. And there was going to be another volume dedicated to Devonshire House in London and Chiswick, which had been inherited from Lord Burlington, as everybody knows. And he was also going to have one on sort of Lismore and Bolton Abbey, you know, the two country houses that came down from Lord Burlington, one in Ireland, one in Yorkshire. And in fact, he never got round to them, but he did do Hardwick, and he also had a little seaside house, a very small house in Brighton, in Kemp Town in Brighton, and he added both Hardwick and Kemp Town onto the Chatsworth volume. And you know, the Hardwick one, he dictated to the agent there, who then wrote it down. And the little Brighton house, he wrote entirely himself. You know, and that again is very personal. So they are all. The handbook is actually the handbook to Chatsworth, Hardwick, and Kemp Town, but we only included Chatsworth in this because it stands on its own. But I mean, you know, it would be worth. I mean, perhaps the National Trust should publish a handbook to Hardwick. You know, it's equally interesting.
And it's probably one for you, John, but maybe Stoker, you could go first. Your daughter Selina is asking: Does the Sixth Duke in the handbook mention any technological or architectural innovations?
You'll have to start again.
In the handbook, in the original, does the Sixth Duke mention any technological or architectural innovations?
Well, he says quite a good deal about the great stove, and there's a good deal about that. But from an architectural point of view, John, can you help me?
There are. He mentions putting the chapel, both what is now your dining room and the chapel ceilings. It started
girders, yes,
in which were very advanced.
Yes, of course.
And he mentions proto-central heating, what he called hot air heating apparatus in the ground floor of the west side, which heated the lower library.
There's a great pity he didn't put any heating in the library. It's absolutely freezing in here.
I think all the books like it cold. Yes.
Well, all right. Well, lucky old them.
I'm getting lots of questions now, mainly from your friends, Stoker. So keep them coming. I'm enjoying this. Christopher Sykes is asking, did the Fifth Duke have many suitors? He must have been extremely eligible. The Fifth Duke, that is.
I think
it's all about the Sixth Duke. So I don't know why Christopher wants to know about the Fifth Duke.
Perhaps he's made a typo. He must have made a typo.
The Sixth Duke did have a number of female close acquaintances, and there are a number of houses round about which were referred to as bird cages. But this might be what James Miller is referring to when he said, did he leave anything out? Because there is nothing about his private life in the handbook, and it would be, I would have thought, rather unsuitable. But there is no record of his main girlfriends, but we can deduce from some of the paintings that there are around the place and people who lived in some of these so-called bird cages, who they were. But I think all more or less lived happily ever after. James, John, have you got anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I mean, you know, his sort of main mistress was Mrs. Warwick, about which we don't know much. The Mrs. may have been honorific, you know, like Mrs. Code, who wasn't married, or housekeeper, who tend to be Mrs. And she had a house on the estate, as you say. And he doesn't mention her by name, but he mentions about his dog pictures. I think in the oak room and on the south front there, the paintings of Tawny and Spot and dogs. And he says, and you know, his sister Harriet would have known what he was referring to. These were in the house at Ashford on the water. So that I find fascinating.
That was at the Rookery where I was born.
Yes.
But it's no longer, it's not ours anymore. But we went there the other day to meet the people who live there now, and they call it their bird cage.
Mm. But I thought it was so touching that his dog picture should have been in her house. It shows he was very fond of her, I think.
So one for you. Has the handbook ever meant that you've held back on doing any changes to the house that you'd like to do to preserve the historical context?
Absolutely not, no. Thanks to Peter Inskip, our architect, we were able to do more or less everything we wanted in the way of changing things. And the handbook was a great help in that way with getting planning permission from the authorities to make changes, because a lot of the changes were back to as it had been in the Sixth Duke's time or before. And for instance, the layout of the sculpture gallery that I mentioned earlier. So no, I don't think, I mean, I'm a great respecter of layers, but I'm also quite enthusiastic, as he was, of generations leaving their mark. And he was, of course, the past master of that. He left a mighty big mark on the place with the wing and the contents and the changes he made to the library, which is in part of the old house. So no, it didn't constrain us at all. And so I hope that answers that question.
It does. Thank you. Rose Cobb wants to know, John, if we know how long it took the Sixth Duke to write the original. Was it?
I think. Sorry. I think about, yeah. Whether he'd been keeping notes and things for longer than that, but the actual writing was done mainly in 1844, and the checking, polishing, and reading the page proofs and things, which he describes as a very enjoyable process, went on into 1845. And he tended to write in the in the autumn and winter, when he used to go and stay in Cullercoats in Northumberland every year, rather windswept East Coast northern seaside resort, very brisk. So he did some of the writing there, for instance, and at Chatsworth in the winter, and at Bolton Abbey.
Dave Carr wants to see a little bit more of the handbook. So here it is, Dave. It really is a very, very handsome publication. You're going to have to come in and see it on our doorstep with your mask on. But what it shows, not only is it a beautiful object, it's what I love about printed books like this is that have been so well designed. And Stoker and John both praised rightly Rob Dalrymple for his immaculate work, as always. That this is the book in my hands is being mediated for us, not by a tech company, or not particularly by a tech company. You can't get this on an electronic reader, and you can't get a lot of the satisfaction from it from any electronic device. It's being mediated brought to us by its original author, by John, its editor, by Stoker's generosity in producing it, by Rob's skill in laying it out, but also by its printers and their great work too. It's not being mediated to us by Silicon Valley, and that's one of the things I'm very keen on about printed books. Now, more questions, a couple more, and then we'll have to finish, sadly. Dina Garrett is wondering, John, if there's a physical Roxburgh Club library that houses all the books that have been published and produced over the years.
Yes, the club itself owns copies of all its own books and its members' books, and there are about 300 of them now after 200 years. We don't have our own premises, but our books are kept at the Society of Antiquaries in Burlington House in Piccadilly. And I stock take them once a year to make sure they're all there, but we keep all our own full, complete, it's the only complete collection of all the Roxburgh Club books are kept there. And if people want to go and study them, they can make appointments to do so.
We have an anonymous question for you, Stoker. Can you remember the first time that you saw the handbook? Was it soon after moving to Chatsworth, and what sort of impression did it have?
Oh no, it was a long time before that. This edition is a single. It's exactly the same as the other original edition, but this white one was always kept by the Duchess of the day, and my mother had it by her bedside, and actually Amanda still has. I just pinched this for this talk. She has it by her bedside, and so I was aware of it from the time that we moved in 1958, when I was just quite young, and it was absolutely not allowed to be moved from there. And so I realized it was very important. And my mother, I know, used it when she was redecorating the house to make it livable in after the war.
John Coyne was asking, is he right in thinking that very few of the personal papers of the sixth Duke survive? Were they destroyed by later generations, and if so, why? Do you know the answer, Stoker?
I don't know the answer, as I don't know so many things. There is quite a lot of his stuff in the archive, but a great deal of the Paxton archive is missing. I do know that. But John, I'm embarrassed, or partly embarrassed, to say that you were likely to know more than me.
I mean, certainly all the architectural, all the papers to do with, the Wyattvilles work in the house, so that all survives. And I would have thought there is quite a lot of correspondence and so on. And his stepmother, Lady Elizabeth Foster, who married, was part of the ménage à trois with Georgiana and the fifth Duke, and then married the fifth Duke after Georgiana died, and then she went to Rome. I mean, there's quite, she acted as the sixth Duke's agent in Rome over the sculpture and things like that. And there's quite a lot of material like that. And I remember when I was writing my book on Cardinal Consalvi, who was a great friend of Elizabeth, Duchess of Devonshire, the sixth Duke paid for the memorial to Consalvi in the Pantheon in Rome, which is a bust by Thorvaldsen, because Elizabeth Duchess was going to do it, and then she died. So the sixth Duke, picked up the tab, which was a very, generous and kind thing to do, really, as it had been his stepmother's idea. And all those sort of papers survive. But other things, I wasn't particularly looking for, but all the things that, in the archive that I was looking for are there. It's all
I'm determined that we finish on time, and it's just a couple more minutes, but there are just two further questions. An interesting one from an old friend of Heywood Hill, Christopher Raper, who says, is there a plan, we're wondering if there would be a possibility of a guidebook based on family papers of houses that are no longer in existence. Now, I think he's referring in particular to, say, Devonshire House, for example, when it comes to the Cavendishes. But what do you think, John? Are there enough papers out there for there to be interesting books produced about houses that no longer exist, or have we had quite a few of those already?
Do you mean houses that belong to the Devonshire?
That was the specific question, yeah.
And yes, both Chiswick and which does exist, but obviously it's now an ancient monument, so to speak. But Devonshire House, which was demolished, is extremely well documented. Sort of all the building accounts, interiors, and a lot of the fixtures and fittings were saved when it was demolished, and the contents are now at Chatsworth. And it's the same with Chiswick. It would be very interesting, I think, to write about Chiswick as it was in Lord Burlington's lifetime, and where all the furniture and pictures were there, which are now, among the great treasures at Chatsworth. So yes, they've both been very good subjects for books, I think.
Well, an interesting idea. So finally, I think for our last question, I'm going to leave to another old friend of Heywood Hill, Randall Dunluce, who asked, what was the main contribution to the collection at Chatsworth that the sixth Duke made? What was his main contribution? John, why don't you go first, and Stoker could answer the same question as well.
Well,
sorry, I don't want to cut off.
You start, and I'm sure there won't be any gaps, but if there are, I'll try and fill them in.
I was just going to say, absolutely, the sculpture gallery, the collection of sculpture is the most important collection of early 19th century neoclassical sculpture in the world. There's, examples by everybody, Canova, Thorvaldsen, all the English sculptors like Chancery and Gibson and so on, and they're Germans and Dutch sculptors, even the first modern Greek sculptor. That's amazing. And then the library, all the treasures that he added to the library, and and then the collection of plants, I would have said. So, you know, 3 major contributions. He also collected pictures, particularly, you know, contemporary watercolorists recording his travels and places that he knew. And they're a very interesting group.
Stoker, before you answer, Stoker, I just want you to also think about, Julian Glover asked what you think the 6th Duke would think of Chatsworth today.
Well, I think, what would he think of Chatsworth today? I hope he'd be pleased. I think he would be thrilled with what's happening in the garden, particularly the rockery, but also there's 16 acres of what was wilderness, always had been wilderness, which Tom Stewart-Smith and Steve Porter, our head gardener, have transformed into an amazing, already brand new, but amazingly wonderful, beautiful series of glades through the garden with views down towards where the great stove used to be. And I think the Duke would be thrilled with that. I think he would be absolutely delighted that so many people come and look at it and enjoy it and walk around it and spend time in the park walking, looking into his views that he'd created, walking in the north part of the park, which he bought from the Duke of Rutland with Paxton's help. I hope that he would be pleased by the contemporary things. He loved contemporary things himself. After all, everything in the sculpture gallery was brand new, as was almost everything at every generation. I mean, the paint was wet on most of the pictures when they arrived here of every generation. It's only because they're old and revered that we think of them as sort of important because they're old, but they were brand new to the people who bought them. So yeah, I hope he would be pleased. I would be incredibly pleased if you were able to walk in now and have a bit of a chat, because I think that would be fascinating.
That's a very nice way to end it. I just want to thank you both on behalf of everybody watching, and thank everybody who is watching and still watching, amazingly, for the full hour. Thank you for joining us. It's been a thrill for all of us to listen to John and Stoker talking about the 6th Duke and this wonderful book. I just want to ask them both to think of a number between 1 and 5,610. John, can you give me your number, please?
Between 1 and
5,610.
Sorry, say that again. I'm not very good at maths.
The number's got to be between 1 and 5,610.
What about 3,050?
And you, Stoker?
555.
555. And I'm adding the two numbers together, dividing by 2, and we have 1,802.5. We're going to forget about the 0.5, and we're going to find the person who has won a book a month, chosen just for them, every month for the rest of their lives. Poor things. No, it's a wonderful thing. And the person who has won is called Bettina Lipman. And it's been given to her, or suggested, she was being suggested by someone called Matt Lee, who I don't know. So that's the excitement tonight, and we'll email them shortly. Thank you both so much for all your time and for those very interesting answers and discussion earlier. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe we'll do it again. But for now, from Mayfair, wishing you all a very good evening. And if you're having brunch in Bel Air or finishing your lunch in a late one in New York, or if you're tucking down for bed in Riyadh, goodbye from Heywood Hill. We'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone. Bye.